back to another episode of Digitalk Architects. Today we have Jeremy Stroup with us. Jeremy, welcome to the show. Please tell us about yourself.
Hey, Carolina, thanks for having me here. Well, the few things we want to mention is this is going to be one of the first podcasts from a startup company called Midgroup AI. We're very excited to have this time here. It's one of those, as you and I have talked before, about lots of good ups and downs. So get a chance to share those, and hopefully that will sound very memorable. And I hope that we can go from there.
We'll
Yes.
make the best of it.
Don't make the best of it. Absolutely. So anyways, it's just been around for a couple of years, and it's a chance where I get to work with different people from different countries. And we're trying to just, like everybody else, solve different things with new problems to solve, which are always fun to do.
Very good. What's your background in business?
So my background is it's a little bit interesting. So I've got over 20 years and primarily working in new product launches, new product development. I started my career at IBM. So at IBM, I was a software engineer, and then I promoted up through the ranks, if you will. They have programs that you end up owning. So ultimately, I left as what they call a product development team lead. This is someone who has the execution requirements for all the P&L. So my teams were international. We had programs anywhere between 100 million in revenue up to 850 million in revenue. And so there was a lot of good things I worked on that. So I've worked with IBM organic products, with reseller type products, as well as acquisitions. And the acquisitions, what I finished there, that part. I did some consulting along the way, and then I worked for a company called In Contact that was eventually acquired by an Israeli company called NICE. And we have a very fun story there. So in less than 10 years, we took a small company that was making about 50 million a year in software revenue and got it up to about $2 billion a year in software revenue, which is just cloud revenue. It's for NICE in that product, it was the leader inside the CCaaS market space. So very, very exciting times. When you're trying to build a platform and a suite of applications that actually allow you to have lots of people interested in it, you have a lot of fun challenges. After that, I end up leaving NICE, and right now it's just been focused on trying to get the startup called Midgroup AI. I have another partner I'd work with, and he has a company called R&D Labs, and so that's one where we've trying to partner with one aspect of one application. And then I've got under Midgroup AI a couple of others that we're working on.
So tell us a little bit about Midgroup AI. And like you said, we've talked before, and I know you were sharing with me that you had to kind of put a pause on your initial launch to focus on accuracy, right? Which is something that a lot of companies overlook. What did that process look like, and how did that change how you think about building AI product?
Yeah, no, great question. So let me step back. So go back to a couple of years ago. Imagine for a moment that this is the launch of people seeing ChatGPT come out. They're a little excited with the latest version. You can just use human language. It's very exciting to engage, and you get some faster responses. And at that time, it became where we're looking at this generative AI. And one of the biggest problems when I was working at NICE, for example, I was like their first CTO chief of staff. I was head of technical program management. I also had R&D operations as a department. So there's a lot going on. And one of the biggest problems you look at is for product development engineers, you start thinking about like the overhead, and think of any business. Any business says, I want to get things out the door, but I've got to spend some time working through this overhead. In the case of product development, that means that your engineers, if they're not working on the features they have to develop, what ends up happening is they might say, I've got to go spend some time in a meeting. And meetings can be important if they can spend some time refining the work and they're coming up with a solution that's fantastic, but it still becomes overhead. And for a lot of product development teams, that was a 35% overhead where you're spending a third of your time just doing the stuff that's not actually completing that work. So in this case, the generative AI seemed like a very exciting opportunity to very quickly do information retrieval, summarization, and be able to generate, for example, some of the stuff that would actually reduce the overhead and hopefully accelerate some of the product development work that we want. And so like many people that had ideas with generative AI became, let's get a wrapper, meaning that let's get an API call back to a language model, and let's tie it into some data integration. So we had a lot of good integrations. And then as you start working, it says, look, it works. It's fantastic. This works. We're getting ready to, maybe we could go ahead and launch this. This was a team I had down in South America. It's one of those that was very exciting. And then came the part where it says, let's start looking at this from how accurate are we with the part that this work that's being generated. I mean, is this spitting out a bunch of noise, or is it actually giving something that's very valuable when people look at it? And I'll tell you, when we started looking at the testing for this, it just said that there was a certain percentage. There was some that was very interesting, and there was some that was also very much noise. And that
Okay.
actually is where what people would expect. What you're dealing with is you don't want to deal with a bunch of noise, meaning that I don't want to deal with an extra, say, 5 to 10, 100 different kind of work items that have absolutely nothing to do, but now I'm spending my time looking at it. So that became a part that says, look, we don't have the infrastructure in place, the architecture in place to make this acceptable from an accuracy standpoint. And so we have that team still working, and what they'll spend their time on is increasing the amount of data integrations and connections that need to be put in place. But in the meantime, for Midgroup AI and a different team, the primary focus is let's make sure that all of our AI engineering, our agentic workflows will support the infrastructure for any application that wants to work with generative AI.
Hmm. Okay. So in that process, you talked to me about something you call acceptable accuracy, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Tell me tell me a little bit about what that actually looks like in real business environments, especially for the small medium size business that wants to implement AI without risking bad outputs.
Yeah, no, yeah, great questions. Let me imagine this. If you're using AI today, I mean generative AI, and you could actually within a day, 2 days, I mean very quickly, within just a few hours, you could get a fantastic looking demo of a product. I have one partner, for example, who has a very great background in uh, user experience and design.
Uh,
And he says, when I get on AI, he says, it's like a junior designer. He says, I can go to, like, for example, Google. I can use anti-gravity. I can use the AI Studio. He says, I can stand up something that looks like an amazing application within a day or two. The challenge, though, is anybody that works on the engineering side of things, you get to look at that and you say, if you try to put that out in production today, it will fail. It won't work for anybody. You're going to get a lot of bad reviews. They say, well, why not? Well, you say things such as what people want is that they need to have some kind of an output, an accuracy that they imagine. Accuracy in many ways is not something that you will necessarily say that it's prescriptive. For some people, it's intuitive. And for some businesses, it has to be very deterministic. So a lot of fun words, but let me explain that. If you come in and say, I think that this is a good idea and it's good enough, like I think that this restaurant absolutely is pretty good, it doesn't instill a lot of confidence. You want to hear somebody that says, this restaurant is amazing. You should absolutely try it. I recommend it 10 out of 10. That is more what we call like a deterministic answer, right? It's a very strong answer and it's very backed up by people say they love it and they know it's going to be very good and you will love it. But other people, if they come in and give you a review that says something that says, I hear that it might be okay. I haven't ever tried it myself, but a few people have said it's good. Some people, not so sure about it. You may not try that restaurant, but that's generative AI. It's very probabilistic. You'll hear the answers like that. And so let's go back to, for example, even last month, Amazon Prime, they have a story where they decided to tell all of their developers they're rolling back their code 90 days because the code that was being used wasn't so much accurate. And as a result, they had orders that were lost. They couldn't take orders off the website. There was different challenges. And this could be as much as like a $6 million impact. So that kind of probabilistic response is something that businesses absolutely need to have. And you only get there when you start applying, say, some of the best practices with engineering. So imagine if I said that you and I, let's say we're going to launch something, we want to have a validation system that has
mhm.
words such as like context architecture and memory systems and evaluation harness. It says that we need to build that infrastructure around it if we want to make sure we add stronger accuracy and outputs in the result that you and I could trust.
Okay. So on that note, on the note of building and accuracy and all of that, a lot of funders rush to build wrappers around, generative AI, in mainstream. From your experience, what separates that real AI solution from just another wrapper?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me answer it like this. Let's call it the unplug test. If I unplug your language model from your product, what do you have left? If the answer is, I really don't have anything, then you have like kind of that wrapper. If the answer is, well, I have validation and I have orchestration and I have a decision intelligence, or I have a way to handle the memory systems, I can actually, then you actually have more of a product. So if you are a business and you're actually trying to say, hey, I need to leverage a language model, I want to be able to connect to my business, and I'm actually now providing something, you have a thin wrapper and you're actually susceptible to problems in your business. But if you go build the rest of that infrastructure and the architecture around it, you have something that's much, much more viable.
Okay, just out of curiosity, when you're, you have a few products, companies, right? What kind of process do you go through to make sure you're not building the wrapper, that you're actually building, something solid?
Yeah. So, the interesting thing here is if you think that, I think that when you're talking about building something solid, let's take, for example, let's talk about, when I talk with other businesses, when I talk with people that are say, like, hey, how do I get into AI? What's the first thing I should go look at trying to do? And I tell people like, there's two things you have to think about. I'll reference a couple of people. There's one guy out of New York City, and his name's Connor Grennan, who I enjoy following him. I love listening to him. And Connor is someone who used to teach and he used to be over at NYU, and he's since left that to focus on what he calls the AI mindset. And what's interesting
Okay.
here is that it's there's a behavioral challenge that he likes to emphasize. So anybody that's say non-technical, this AI is a mindset. It is a behavioral challenge in front of everybody. And what that means is that you have people that think I mean, all of us as humans, we have been trained primarily by someone like Google to retrieve information like it's a keyword search, meaning that we treat AI like it's a tool. And the interesting part here is I don't see AI, the generative AI specifically, as a tool because a tool denotes the idea that it's a tool that I pick up, I use, I drop off. I go to Google search, I put in my request, I put in some information, it gives me an output. I put it down, I move on, right? I accept the output. And in reality, we want to move this and treat it more like a utility, like it's electricity, like it's something that says that what would I do when I have electricity around me? And the reason why that's so important is because we were going to see a lot of changes in behavior in the tasks that a business will do. So some examples. I have a subscription to one tool called Otter AI. It allows that basically they can summarize very quickly meeting minutes. Right, we join a
Hmm.
meeting, it's summarized, it captures it very well, it does the transcription, and allows us to do that. For meetings where I get called into where I don't want to be what I'll call single threaded. If I'm going to be informed and they want me in that meeting, I don't want to say that I'm blocking out the meeting because I'm blocked with or I have a meeting conflict. For meetings where I need to be informed, I can take all meetings now. I can have 3 meetings at the same time. I just send my Otter note taker for me, and I get a transcription summary very quickly afterwards. I can work on the 3 projects simultaneously from that perspective. So if
Correct.
behavior changes, I don't have to block out my calendar because one meeting is only there. I can say, if you're going to just keep me informed, then take up as much time as you want. No problem. Okay, let's do that. That's a behavior change. So in many ways, we need everybody, all humans, for example, to understand that there are certain tasks that require a different behavioral change, and that is where we need to spend the time training that. And so if you're in a business, if you're a leader, you need to lead. You need to take on those AI pilots first, accordingly. Now, if you're specifically as a technical person, that is not so much behavioral because technical people will dive into the technology. So for the
Yes.
technical people, their challenge is going to be more architectural. So if you want to have a successful business, are you non-technical because you're, solving business problems? Or are you on the technical side where you need to solve architectural problems? And so then you start building things such as context architecture, how to capture what Carolina wants and make sure what she intends or the semantics of that are captured accurately enough that now I'm ready to take that back to maybe a language model, create the inference or create specifically the output that she's looking for, and confirm this is exactly the answer that she wants, and a way that we can actually test that and evaluate that.
You talk a lot about context, and for our audience, maybe that's not a well-known topic. You wanna,
Sure.
like, maybe explain that a little bit more so that people understand in the world of AI what context mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's very interesting. There's in software engineering, one of the biggest challenges that we talk about is the semantic gap. That means what the business wants. They may not have the technical know-how or the technical communication, but then you have the technical expertise that says, I'm trying to understand what you want, and I have to make sure that matches together. The interesting thing is, and this came from a leadership development, that I had a CEO come up and talk about this. He says, as humans, you go back millions and millions of years, and he says that we learned that if we wanted to survive, we had to build connections with each other. And so that affected specifically our brains. Okay, so over time, our brains became where we could gather the context. So today, if I ask you, you and I are having dinner, for example, and I say, would you mind passing the salt? You would be able to pick up the salt and you would, hand it to me or whatever, so I could put it on the meal, and it's easy. But if I ask AI to pass me the salt, that AI doesn't know anything else. If I have a very generic request, that AI may pick up the salt and it might throw it down at me very hard. It may slowly do it. It might roll it over to me. It just doesn't have that context because I wasn't specific enough. So when we say a context architecture is we're still dealing with a probabilistic system that deals with math, what deals with numbers, and it deals with the location of that. And it's trying to identify where is your context. When you want to pass the salt, I have to not guess, but I should say probabilistically compute what you mean by that. And if I don't have the right answer, because I might come up with 5 or 6 different answers, one might be the same kind of context at which you intend, and the 4 or 5 others may not be. So when we talk
Right.
about context architecture for AI, what we're trying to say is, what is the engineering and architecture we need to build to ensure that we can capture the context of what you mean when you're engaging with the AI, with generative AI?
What is the relation? So I know with AI, there's a huge relation between context and memory,
Yeah,
and then you get into the topic of hallucination and, forgetfulness, if you might say it that way, where, one day he knows everything and the next day he knows nothing.
right. Yeah,
I have had that experience, believe me, it's not fun. One day it was very smart, and the next day it was very, very not smart. And then it was like, what did I do? What did I do wrong that this thing no longer remembers everything I thought it yesterday or the day before?
right. Yeah. And you are hitting 100% on what the business needs to build so that your experience is not like that. See, keep in mind, when you actually, and this might get a little more technical than we want, but keep in mind that when you go to a language model, it's a chat bot, and you put in something that says, help me analyze and look at, for example, say all the capitals of Europe, for example, and the cities that are there that have at least 1 million people, and then go and tell me, for example, which ones might be interested in purchasing digital marketing ads here with my company. Okay, so you've got a lot of items that are there because you're really interested in who might be potential customers. So you put that in, right, and you send it. So when you send it, what ends up happening is there's like they call it encoding, but there's a conversion, if you will, to say like I need to take every word that you have and I need to make that into a conversion that becomes like a number and it becomes a location. And that number and location is what's happening on the back end. And then it says, well, what are the closest numbers or the closest locations to what you're talking about? So then I could try to find the answer. And then they do the decoding or they do another conversion back into the human language to tell you an answer. Now, when you say that sounds like great information, you know what would also be interesting is also tell me which one of them might be over the age that they're adults. I don't want to just know about kids. I just, give me the adults that are over the age of 18. Now that becomes a second part in your mind in the conversation, which you should always have a conversation with AI, but that conversation is natural for you. However, it becomes a new response. I got to go do another conversion. It's asking for this. So when you said, what's kind of memory systems, the business has to say, we need to capture what you just said and then what you want to follow on to, And we can do one of two things. We can either stitch it together, resend the whole thing, so now it becomes a larger calculation. Or we can do a memory system, say, let me think of what was said there before, capture that, remember what's there, and then I can actually help give a better answer. So this is where someone like Google does very, very well, because that conversation you have in that one moment with that chatbot becomes what they call a context window. And a context window says within this window, you and I could have a very large conversation, and it will remember, meaning it will capture everything that we're talking about and continually do that conversation. So when you said the next day I came back in, it's like, wow, this thing forgot what I just said. That's because behind the scenes, there's money and there's costs involved. And if we're not using this, then I can pause that. I don't have to spend the costs. But if you want to have a very good experience the next day, they might have to say, let's remember what the conversation was because you're using the same chatbot window. And now we want to capture all of that and resend it for the calculation or conversion, if you will call it that. The technical term is like an encoding and decoding,
Okay. So it
right?
was
I know
technical.
there's a lot there,
It's a
but
little bit.
let's say for your business, you want to have this conversation that says, look, I'm trying to do a business analysis and I'm still working it today and tomorrow and the day after. Your business would want to say, I need to build, for example, I would have a context engineering and I need to include memory as part of that so that we could always capture both your context of what you mean when you're talking about it, as well as the same time, I can remember what we talked about. And now I can regenerate or infer, for example, a better answer for you. So this is the difference between, hey, I just have a wrapper, I'm just doing a call, and why did I not remember what I talked about yesterday, versus here are engineering principles and layers that we need to add in order to have a better and more accurate response here.
Yeah, and you know what's important here, and I know it's a little bit technical, but I think it's things that most at the high level business owner uh high level view, it's something that most business owners wouldn't think about, right? Like when they're planning for. Listen, I have a lot of conversations nowadays with small and medium sized businesses on the implementation of AI into their business. They wouldn't know these things, right? Like they would go, and I can just see the frustration building. Like I said, even for me, and it was like, what just happened, right? Like why and the thing is it doesn't happen always, right?
Right.
It goes up and down, right? Because of what you're saying, right? That context builds and builds and builds, and then when it's finally full, it just has to kind of pause and reset or do something with the information, and so as a non-technical person, right, I can see how a business owner that just wants to get it done would get like
Yeah.
super frustrated if they came across that experience, right? Because he'll go like, I just wanted to do the job, right? And if these tools are going to replace or go hand in hand with real people shouldn't have to experience those frustrations. And so I can see, you know, businesses planning or talking about implementing AI into their businesses and then hitting roadblocks and frustrating points on things that they weren't necessarily, knowledgeable or aware of, of things that could happen with it, right? And so, you as I was telling you, like I went, it was going great, So I had my experiences is I started training my AI and I had put a solid, 2 weeks into it, and I had done a lot. Believe me, it was,
Yeah.
a fair bit of work to get it to where to that point. And then when one morning I get back to work and I asked something and all of the sudden it was gone. And I'm like, and the key point was I had spent quite a bit of time setting up the email process, right? So the access to my email and you have to be, do all the security checks and making sure that it has guardrails around it and it's not gonna fire up 1,000 emails to the wrong people and so on. But anyways, I had done all of that and I come in this morning, it's supposed to give me my morning brief with like my inbox status. And there is no inbox status. So I ask, what is this? It's like, I don't have access to email. And I'm like, what? I'm like, I just spent hours giving you access to all of it and setting it all up. So I know you have access. So I go back and I said, check your notes from yesterday. You should have access, right? Let's
Yeah.
go. There's nowhere to be found. And I'm like, I don't have access. And I'm like, no, but you do, right? Anyways, this AI conversation went for a few minutes. I'm like, I'm already like frustrated because I had spent so much time on it. So I'm like, here are the instructions, follow them again, right? So I send the instructions again, and now I'm trying this. So, I'm as I'm doing it, I'm learning, right? So there
Right.
are things that obviously I didn't know from the beginning. If I had known them, probably would have done a much better job. So I finally, look it up and I'm like, why is this happening? And find out that you have to, go and put it on or make sure that the MD files for your memory and your tools are updated and so on. So I go and I make really nice notes and whatever. It does it again,
Yeah.
like a few days later, and I'm like, I'm done. No, I'm not done, but I was frustrated, right? So one thing that I've noticed, like with AI, that is one of the main problems, but it's also because it's such a problematic thing today. So many new tools are coming out to try and help it, right? So it is getting better, but it's definitely a pain point for a lot of people that in the and so why I bring it, here is because when I'm helping business people, like those are the things that you have to consider because a business person, they won't care. They'll just turn around to you and say, why is this happening? What did you send me up with? This is garbage, right? So much to consider, right? And yes, we've come a long way, but it certainly has its own, issues and roadblocks and things that we gotta overcome for ourselves and for the people we're trying to help with it that they're not necessarily aware of, right?
Right. Yep.
Um,
And I'll tell you right now, you're touching on the exact opportunity that we also want to tackle. And the idea is that there's a lot of businesses, and rightfully so, they don't want to spend the time saying, do I need to go learn AI engineering, for example? And at the same time, I don't want to spend the money to hire a whole department around AI engineering. So what we'd like
that's
to
true.
do
Yeah.
for like our business, for example, is we'd like to bring that where it's just easy for you. Why would you want to spend
Yeah.
2 weeks putting something up? We'd want to make it so it's easy enough that says, you know what, this is what I want. I want to be able to handle my emails, and you just take care of it so that you can spend your time on things that are more creative or things that are more strategic or something on customer research, right? The things that actually will help drive your business. So
That's
part of the
just it.
things, yeah, absolutely. So we want to do things. We've got 3 applications we're trying to work on. All three are tied towards just making it so it says if you're a business and you're a small medium business, but if you're a small business and you actually don't want to put all that extra money and effort and time into it, and you don't want to spend say 10,000 a month trying to go to like a cloud API for ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, then we want to make it so that this becomes easy for you. It doesn't cost you a lot until the business says we must have high accuracy, a decision making. We want to have, like, for example, a certain amount of trust, because if you're a medical business and you're dealing with people's lives, that is a high critical decision. You don't want the AI to do it by themselves. So you're going to say, I need to know when this is ready for me as a doctor to step in and now specifically make sure that I agree with this approach. All of that takes a lot of extra work on the back end. That's what we'd like to do, is be able to focus on that. So one application we're looking at is today there is an AI agent to an AI agent protocol that has become
Hmm.
pretty standard now. Anthropic launched it. They called it the MCP, and this model
Yeah.
context protocol, right, has been turned over to the Linux Foundation, and so they get to say everybody uses it, and it's very common. But now it allows you to say, let's say you use a tool like Notion. You want Notion to come in and summarize your emails and stuff like that. Your agents can do that. But we would like to come in, for example, and say, if you're a business and you have several things you want to do, you don't want to spend the time having to set up the MCP connections or the hosts and the servers and the clients and try to set up your agents to do all that. That becomes a lot of extra work. If we can actually build something that says, like, for example, here's an easy, UI master wizard, if you will, You just tell it what you want, you set it up, here you go, you're set. There's another company called Zapier that does this very, very well, but they do it on the automation side with the agents. Some are
Hmm.
looking to try to do it with skills. So there's a lot of companies that are working and trying to take advantage of. So I'd say that the good news is there are people working on it. And hopefully at some point you'll say, man, I love this because it's so easy. I just tell it what I want. You know that it's happening on the back end. You don't care how it's working. You just know it works for you exactly the way you want. It didn't forget your email that it didn't have access. It didn't forget like what you were talking about yesterday.
I know.
It's okay. I got it. I don't worry about emails. Let me go look at the next digital creative ad that we have to go and do.
Yeah. Okay. So we're talking about implementing agents, the challenges that come with it. But there's one thing that's been sort of the hype around AI, and it's replacing jobs. You touch on behavior needing to change instead. And I agree with it. Right. So,
Mhm.
I've talked about this before in the podcast where I don't necessarily think that it's replacing jobs as much as it is improving, making people more productive in their jobs. And obviously, when you make people more productive, things happen. But it can happen two ways. It can drive your business to become bigger and better, or you make the decision that you're good where you are and, you know, one person less can do the job, whatever.
Yes. Yeah. The concept of AI replaces jobs. And first off, I want to be very sensitive because there are many, many people that will hear that message. Right? The work that I'm doing, my job has been replaced by AI. The company did a layoff, for example. And especially in finance and the tech world, this is a big thing. You know, in fact, the Gallup just released their state of the AI, if you will, report, and they listed some numbers. So I'll put the numbers here. They'll say that 18% of people, humans, believe that AI will replace their jobs within the next 5 years. If you're a company, their next thing they say is that if your company has already implemented AI, that number jumps up to 23%. And if you're working in finance or the tech side of the world, that number's at 30%. That means 1 out of 3 people believe AI is replacing their jobs, which that can be a lot of different people. Personally, I would say this is that absolutely there are parts where AI replacing job has been the statement. It's a framing. And I do believe there's one part that's real and one part that's counterproductive because at the same time, if you create the fear of AI replacing your job, it's not the story of like, what's our strategy in order to grow jobs to make sure that we're adjusting to this new change. So what I think for businesses, you have to understand that little bit of a distinction. The behavioral change at the organization level means that, just like I said, you don't need to spend 4 hours writing a draft of a marketing a campaign. We should say the task has changed. So maybe there's an AI generated draft, or maybe a draft what you did before and AI reviews it. You do it in 30 minutes. Now you reclaim your next 3.5 hours and you focus on that strategy. Or maybe it's going to be like, what's the creative direction it has from it? So the job itself, the marketing job, it didn't disappear. However, the behavior and the task, the part that's low leverage, if you will, that behavior has changed. And so we need people to be able to say, I've recognized that this has changed, and I need to now look at what that looks like. History actually has taught us how to do with this. There are classes I teach at university. It's fun for me. It's just an adjunct. I get to teach a few classes, but these classes are around AI, the computer science, or software engineering. And so when I talk with the students in the first introduction class, we talk about things such as I remember a time when the calculator had come out. People were doing math on pieces of paper, long division, and they would say, "We're going to ban the calculator because it's cheating." In math class. And then now
Yeah.
everybody uses it. You must have a calculator, right? It's part of that's the tool part. Or if you were doing manual labor, when the front loader, like a bulldozer, had come out, you didn't hire 15 people with shovels. You hired one person that would know how to operate, for example, that. And then you might have someone else that maintains it, and you might have somebody else that says, I have to like observe it. So the job, for example, itself didn't disappear because you still had to dig a hole and build a house at a foundation on it. But the way that was done is now different. And those people that were holding those shovels will absolutely say, my job has disappeared because that front loader was invented. True. That behavior, that task is absolutely gone. I might still hire someone to do the shoveling, but I now need to have somebody that's learned how to operate this heavy machinery because I can actually do more than just with the 15 people. So I would encourage everybody, every human specifically, it says that you absolutely need to look and have this behavior changes. Talk to the generative AI like it's 100% just like a normal conversation. And that's your starting point. It's not the end point. That's your starting point. And we see a lot of people that are early adopters that are jumping in and they can find that, wow, I feel so much more productive. The interesting thing is, I try to teach students that they have to become now the experts, experts at which to say, this generative AI code is incorrect. It's not following best practices. We can see that it's going to make a mistake when it gets out there and it's going to cause problems. We want to teach others to say that when you look at something else, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't look right. Today, you can even see some AI generated videos that look amazing and others to say, wow, that looks really, really off, right? That does not work. So we
I
want people
agree.
to change that behavior. And then the ones that are in technical, I mean, I work in the technical field. If I'm looking for a job, I would say it's very hard. You see thousands of people trying to apply for the same job. We still want people to spend their time trying to learn how to build something new. And everybody should become more like that builder, a strategist, a way to say that what are new problems we can go work on because I have this utility that enables me to do something faster, to do something in parallel, right? I can work on multiple projects at the same time. And at some point, what I'd love to do is make it so that I have a platform that just comes to your business and you say, I need 5 agents to work on a digital campaign, and I need 5 agents to help me with my business operations. And if we just get it handed to you, that operates because you want to go work on 10 more creative ideas you've had, and you don't need to have it as a 5 year plan. It becomes like, I'm working on this right now for my next 10 ideas that I have. We want people to learn to be very creative. We want people to think of at a higher level, the creativity, problem solving, innovation. And that's way more exciting than saying, how do I transpose, my spreadsheet from Excel to whatever accounting software that I have?
So on the discussion of small businesses and, the implementation and you both being technical and strategic for AI, how do you okay, so two questions. The first one is, where do you see most businesses getting AI implementations wrong? And then the other question is, how do you balance building something powerful while still making it usable for non-technical people?
Oh, I love these questions. Okay, so on your first one, it is, where do businesses kind of get implementation wrong right now? I'd say there's probably three specific mistakes. The first one is if companies come in and say they have a single model dependency, you just pick one model, you think that's all you're going with, like connected to, say, GPT, ChatGPT 4, and they leave it alone. Like, that's just a single route. That's going to get very bad. That's going to be expensive. It could be overkill. It could be something that says that, if that changes, and we've actually seen this at one point, OpenAI made a change with the router and it killed a lot of businesses because they only had one model that they were dependent upon. So you want to build a multi-model routing capability. That's one of the first things. Now you can say I have small tasks that can go to small, cheaper models, and then something that's going to be very much more complex, I can go to that to the more capable ones. So I would encourage any business to be multi-model routing. The second mistake I would say is that they don't put any kind of validation layer in. I mean, a lot of people today says I put in a prompt like I'm treating it like a Google search. I get a response back, and now I just say, "This is my answer. Here you go." I encourage every student, every person I engage, any response you get out of AI, you need to first challenge it. If you don't have a validation layer put in place, then you need to challenge that. You need to say, look at the way that this, analyze your response right now and tell me what's wrong with it. And so you could do that. But I mean, that would be if you don't have a validation layer, it's like I'm trying to have a developer who writes code and they just go straight to production. There's no testing involved, there's no reviews. If they don't have anything along those lines, we would never accept that in software engineering. So, but somehow we think that because the AI did it and it sounds good, I just accept that blindly. You don't want to have that.
Hmm.
The third and last mistake I'll say, it would be what I call like observability. Okay, you need to be
You,
able to. What?
Sorry, you just reminded me of, I don't know if you've seen that post of the newspaper with the I'm assuming AI generated article. They forgot to validate, the output because they
Uh,
put it on, and then at the bottom it says, if you want, you know how AI in general, when they finish something, they ask you a question at the bottom. Like, do you want me
yeah.
to continue, or do you want to add this to? So anyway, so
Yep.
they pasted the whole reply with the question at the bottom
Yes.
for the publication. And that was the first thing that, it reminded me when we're talking about validation. Those are the consequences of not validating your
Absolutely.
answers,
That's
and that
right.
was a pretty bad one because, like, that got published.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there are many, many of those stories that surprisingly that's what ends up happening. The third one I'll say for a company is going to be observability, right? People have no idea what their AI is doing. You want to know what it's doing, what's the cost of that task it's working on, where did it fail? Do you know why it failed? Right? There's no way to optimize if you can't measure that. And you can't fix it if you can't see it, right? In
Yep.
many ways, unless we're, with billions of dollars doing our own training, which we don't have, then that means that someone like OpenAI or Google's Gemini, Anthropic's Claude, for example, Grok's XAI, those are all black boxes. We don't know what they're doing behind the scenes. And so therefore, we need to be able to build what we'll call language model pipelines and says, well, I know what I'm going to get out of it, and I can't control that. But what I can control is what happens to it before it goes in and what it comes out afterwards. So observability is going to be a big aspect because there are people, for example, today that one of their hypes is like, let's build an open claw on a Mac, for example, get my agents running. And I see these stories all the time. Well, I got it running. Oh, I just got my first $200 build the next day because what happened? Oh, it's $900, right? They don't know what their tasks are doing. They're not structuring it for what they have to do.
And that's why when it became so popular, one of the main things was like building these mission control panels, right? Because they needed some sort
Yeah.
of observability put in place for these agents. Okay, yeah, I remember the hype. It was everywhere. The mission control, the mission control. So much of it was talked about. I mean, it's still pretty big, and now we're doing it for a bunch of different ones and different reasons. But I think that was one of the main reasons. You got the stories of the guy, burning $1,000 over, what was it, a couple days, setting up their agent. Okay, so let's jump to the second question of that two question.
Yeah. Okay. So I think you said the question was like, how do you build something that's powerful but making it usable for non-technical teams, right?
Yes.
The interesting thing is there's a part here where if any business is going to plan to build something that has generative AI tied to any kind of outcome, it's tied to revenue, it's tied to sales, it's going to be tied to something like that. The interesting thing is for the first time, I would say almost the first time in history, we have to design and orchestrate systems for more than just humans. IBM likes to bill it as like what they call a non-human identity. So the popular term is called, you'll hear AI agents. And that means that there's an experience where both AI agents as well as humans have to interact with this new system that you're going to build. So what I would say is there's a certain amount of depth and I need it without complexity. So on the human side, it's easy to answer because simplicity, interaction, the user experience, you make that super simple. That is a competitive advantage. I can tell you right now, there was a time at IBM where in their enterprise storage, they sold these large disk systems to companies. And a company out of Israel actually had built something similar, but it wasn't as good in terms of, like, say, for example, the offerings, the features on that storage. However, the simplicity of being able to use it won everybody over. Everybody loved it so much. So IBM ended up having to go and acquire that company because they needed that intellectual property to make it simple. So the complexity is absolutely real, and businesses have to do that on the technical side, but they have to design it in a way that it becomes an abstraction that you don't get to see that one. So, like, for example, what our focus is on the back end, I can tell you this. When I think of accuracy, I'm building like a multi-model validation layer. And then I have, for example, I might say something like, I need to have an intelligent routing layer, and I need to have a cost optimization layer, and I need to have like a domain and a guardrail layer. So there are multiple layers, multiple tiers, and that's the complexity that I need to go focus on building. But to you, it needs to be that just something as simple as says, I just need an agent to go check my emails. Trust the business is actually going to optimize the cost so you don't see a $10,000 monthly bill, you see maybe a $200 monthly bill. You know that it's checked, for example, the answers. You not only check, for example, that you ask a very good question, that it's not a toxic type question or a bad actor type, injection type um, hack, if you will. But it's going to be a legitimate one. It's going to check did it have the right kind of access? We want to give you an answer that's also been checked. So we want to do what I would say a lot of businesses are working with generative AI right now, which is you start using AI more and more, but they won't trust the output. So that is the gap. That's going to be a new AI gap that we have to deal with, which is I need to make sure that we build enough of a system of complexity on the back end that you begin to trust the output from the AI, from that generative AI specifically. And I use the word generative AI because traditionally it's been a lot of like predictive AI. I've done a lot of work around predictive AI. That is the data science, predictive analytics. Okay, so you merge both of those together so you can increase the trust that you have. For the most part, people that are non-technical, they don't want to deal with the technical stuff. They just want to know that it says, I can tell you in my words what I want, and you're going to match exactly what I expect out of you.
Okay.
There's a lot there.
It's a lot, but let me ask you this question. If you were advising an SMB business today that wants to start using AI beyond just the basic, what would be the first system or workflow that you tell them to build? I know it's a loaded question, but like if you had one that's like always in your mind, what would it be?
You know what? I'll tell you right now, that's almost actually very simple. I would tell them build specifically an internal knowledge agent. And here's why.
Okay.
Within any business, there are business that is like tribal knowledge. It's trapped in someone's head. They've been around a long time. They know how it is. Maybe someone wrote it up in the Google Docs. Maybe they talked about it on Slack. They talked about Microsoft Teams. Or maybe there's that one spreadsheet that only one person knows. That is very underutilized. Every business, no matter how small or big, has that kind of tribal knowledge sitting around everywhere. So you build, for example, the internal knowledge agent, let's call it that, and it starts connecting to those sources. You got to find a way. How do I talk with this person and get that information? How do I scan the Google Docs? How do I scan the emails? You can index all of that. You can use just natural language, and now you can get that information back. Here's what it is good about it. So it does a couple things, is that you get immediate measurable value. You get to practice it. Nobody gets fired because the agent that summarized like last quarter's business review meeting notes inaccurately or imperfectly, for example. Okay, you don't get fired over that. But now someone might say, what's our refund policy for this client? Or someone says, what's the actions from last quarter's planning meeting? Or how did we handle this the last time the shipment was delayed from this vendor? That information, you don't have to go and interrupt a colleague working on it. It just gives you the answer because now it's been captured. So that internal knowledge is one that's going to be fantastic to work with. And two, it allows your team to now start building the muscle memory and identify potential trust issues. And then they can expand there from, say, higher stake workflows. So I would absolutely tell anybody, start with the internal and take everyone's tribal knowledge so that it becomes easy to answer for someone. If you have your own internal chatbot, you can do an open source local model. It costs nothing more than electricity and the system it sits on.
Very good. The question there, I guess it came to mind is if you're building the internal knowledge initially, it's probably not as big of a deal as most people think. I think the main challenge there is how do you keep that updated going forward?
And
Because
that's
you
what
will need
these
to be, purposely updating it regularly to keep the information. The initial portion, it's, you just load it because it's already there and it's available. But over time, that has to be updated. So, you kind of have to put a process in place for people to follow and keep it up to date as time moves forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's structure that as what is another thing that people are working on. It's another layer, but it's how does your AI continually learn?
Mm-hmm.
So that is also a system design setup. So when you first set this up for the internal agent, you might say, I've captured all this. Did I capture it in a way that's a one-time only, or did I capture in a way that says maybe that any Google Doc that gets created, any Microsoft Word doc gets created, then it always will absolutely maybe gets to be scanned and it gets to be retrained, if you will. So there's or maybe it retrieves that information. Either way, you have to design it that says, I know that this is not a one-time only snapshot of information. I can actually say that it will continually get new information. So where does that information get stored? Where does the language model get to check on that information before it gives you the answer? So that's what you're always going to end up doing. That's why this is a continuous process. That's why, the utility approach is going to be like, hey, this will help me. But if it becomes outdated and gives me incorrect information or outdated information, we don't like to use it. I don't know if you've ever tried this before, but I remember when ChatGPT, like the 3.5, 4 came out, people would ask questions, hey, what's happening today? And the response was, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that. I was only trained with
I was
information up
trying to tell you
to
22,
October of last year, right? So
October
they solved,
2022.
yeah,
It was
yeah, exactly. So they solve that problem because they don't tell you that information, but then now they spend the time trying to always get the latest information, or they find a way to look it up. So every business kind of has to follow that same model if you're doing it internally.
okay. So closing question here. Looking
Okay.
ahead, as we move forward and AI continues to, make progress and we move from single agents to multi-agent environments and AI employees, what do you think the role of a business owner or operator will look like, let's say in the next 2 to 3 years?
So yeah, this is a, what does the crystal ball look like to Jeremy here kind of thing. My crystal ball kind of looks at it as, and this is how I try to help train and teach others and mentor them, is that I think that what you'll see is people becoming less of like an operator and more to like orchestration. They're going to be an orchestrator. So, because that's what we're trying to solve right now, even at just a platform level. So, a business owner today, right, will manage people to do the tasks. Hey, we need to do char, we need to do finance, we need, you're operating that for these people to do it. But I think what will end up happening is a business will have a hybrid workforce. They're going to have people and agents. And so your agents might end up handling your tier one customer support. Your agents might monitor your supply chain. Your agents might generate your weekly reports. Your agents might process your invoices. Okay. And I think that you'll have the people who have to focus on very strategic thinking. What's the kind of relationship? They should focus on building those relationships with people. They have to have creative and innovative work. They have to make the judgment call. I mean, there's going to be a certain amount of business has to decide how much risk they're willing to take with the decisions that get made. And I say that intentionally because if I want to say that my accuracy is good enough, and it might be only 90%, it might be 90% accurate, that's a business risk decision. And at the same time, I might say, with my business bank account, 90% accurate is not good enough. It has to be more like a 99.99% accurate. And so now that's what will separate, say, average, I would say great operators from the average ones might be those that can be literate in when it comes to orchestration. Do you understand how to deploy agents? Do you understand how to set the right guardrails? Do you understand how to monitor performance? Do you know when to intervene? Do you know how to coordinate between human and AI capabilities? I can tell you that when I was working with all these executives and the senior leaders, I can tell you that some of the hardest problems was not the technology. The hardest problems was coordinating between everybody that had to work with the technology and to accomplish like what the business wanted. And so I think that business owners will become like a great orchestrator if you can understand how to design that. This is going to be real. This is going to happen. The AI agent market alone within the next, like, I think 8 to 10 years is going to be like 230, $250 billion worth. So
That's
that's to me,
incredible.
the next 2 to 3 years, you want the business owners to say, how do I become literate enough that I can orchestrate and coordinate between humans and agents to accomplish these same tasks?
Very good. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming out and spending this time with us and sharing your knowledge and everything you know about AI in the small and medium sized business world and everything you're doing with it. Thank you so
Yes.
much. For
Thank you
everyone
for having
else,
me.
thank you.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate it. No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate our conversation, and I look forward to having more.
Will do. I'm sure there'll be more considering, how big this is getting.
Yeah.
For everyone else, thank you so much for listening to us one more time. We'll see you in the next episode.
Right. Thank you.
All right. That is a wrap. We are done. See?